When you first see a headline like Boeing shifting work to Canada and Trump exploding in response, it sounds like just another episode in the endless political drama, another angry post, another trade fight, another round of blame. But if you slow down for a moment, if you really look at what is happening beneath the noise, you begin to see something far more important. This is not just about Boeing. It is not even really about Trump. It is about how modern capitalism actually works and why slogans about Made in America collapse the moment they collide with corporate power and global supply chains. Most people heard the surface story. Canada secures new aerospace contracts. Boeing expands production north of the border. Trump reacts with fury and threats. The media frames it as a personality clash, a betrayal, a sudden shock. But nothing about this is sudden, and nothing about it is accidental. What you are watching is the predictable outcome of a system that rewards cost cutting, flexibility, and leverage over loyalty, community, or national rhetoric. Officially, the story goes like this. The United States imposed tariffs on imported aircraft components, promising to protect domestic jobs and strengthen American manufacturing. Boeing, facing higher costs and fractured supply chains, adjusted its strategy. Canada, with public investment, skilled labor, and stable trade conditions, offered an attractive alternative. New contracts were signed. Facilities in Quebec and Ontario expanded. Jobs that might once have gone to Washington State or Missouri now go elsewhere. End of story. But that version leaves out the most important question. Why does a company that constantly wraps itself in the language of American greatness so easily move production across borders the moment incentives shift? The answer is not hypocrisy in a moral sense. It is structure. Boeing is not a patriotic institution. It is a profit-driven corporation embedded in a global system where capital moves freely and labor does not. For decades, aerospace manufacturing has depended on international supply chains. EU parts move between Mexico, Canada, Europe, and the United States as a matter of routine. That system was not created by workers. It was designed by executives, trade negotiators, and policymakers who believed that efficiency and shareholder value mattered more than local resilience. When tariffs are imposed without restructuring that underlying system, the result is not protection. It is disruption. Companies respond not by absorbing losses out of national loyalty, but by shifting geography. This is where Canada enters the picture. Canada did not steal anything. It did not ambush the United States. It did what rational states do within this system. It invested in skills, infrastructure, and predictability. It offered Boeing a way to maintain production while avoiding uncertainty and cost volatility. From a corporate perspective, this is not a betrayal. It is rational behavior under capitalism. Now think about who pays the price. It is not Boeing's executives. It is not the shareholders diversified across global portfolios. It is the machinist in Washington, the technician in Kansas, the supplier in the Midwest whose livelihood depends on stable production. These workers were told that tariffs would protect them. Instead, they are watching work migrate across the border because the system was never designed to prioritize them in the first place. This is why the political reaction feels so raw. Trump built his image on the promise that he alone could defend American workers from globalization. Yet here we see globalization not retreating, but rerouting. The anger you see is not just political theater. It reflects a deeper contradiction between nationalist rhetoric and a corporate economy that has no nation at all. And this is the part the media rarely asks you to think about. If tariffs alone could protect jobs, why are corporations so quick to leave anyway? If slogans were enough, why would a company like Boeing make this calculation? The answer is that power lies with capital, not with workers, and not with voters chanting at rallies. As we go forward, the real question is not whether Canada wins or the United States loses in some scoreboard sense. The question is whether ordinary people will continue to be told comforting stories while decisions that shape their lives are made elsewhere, quietly, rationally, and without them at the table. Keep that in mind as you listen to the outrage, because what looks like a sudden collapse is really the system doing exactly what it was built to do. Once you see it that way, the anger and confusion surrounding this moment start to make more sense. People are not just reacting to a factory moving or a contract being signed. They are reacting to a growing realization that the promises made to them were never structurally possible within the system as it exists. When politicians say they will force corporations to behave patriotically without changing the rules that govern corporate behavior, what they are really offering is symbolism in place of power. Look closely at how Boeing arrived here. Over many years, the company was encouraged to optimize for financial performance above all else. Production was fragmented across borders to reduce costs. Labor was treated as a variable expense rather than a social foundation. Share buybacks were rewarded more than long-term investment in domestic capacity. None of this happened because of Canada. It happened because the financial architecture of modern capitalism rewards short-term returns and punishes restraint. So when tariffs were introduced, Boeing faced a choice: absorb higher costs and risk shareholder backlash, or reorganize production to maintain margins. Within this system, there is no real choice at all. Executives are legally and culturally trained to follow the money. Canada offered certainty. The United States offered volatility. The outcome was inevitable. This is why focusing only on Trump's reaction misses the point. Yes, his rhetoric intensified the moment. Yes, his political brand is under pressure. But the deeper issue is that no president, regardless of personality, can command corporations to sacrifice profitability for national loyalty unless the entire incentive structure changes. Without that shift, capital will always outrun politics. Think about what this looks like on the ground. A skilled worker who has spent decades mastering aerospace manufacturing is suddenly told that the market has moved. A community built around a plant begins to hollow out. Local businesses suffer. Young people leave. These are not abstract costs. They are lived realities. And they are remarkably similar whether the factory moves to Canada, Mexico, or overseas. The destination changes, but the pattern remains. Meanwhile, Canada celebrates, and understandably so. From their perspective, this is validation. Stable policy, public investment, and long-term planning attracted high-value work. But even here, there is a lesson. Canada's success does not come from beating workers elsewhere. It comes from operating more coherently within the same global system. Canadian workers benefit today, but they too remain vulnerable tomorrow if incentives shift again. This is where the media framing fails most dramatically. Coverage centers on anger, betrayal, and national rivalry. What is rarely discussed is why workers in different countries are pitted against one another at all. Why is the choice framed as jobs in Seattle versus jobs in Montreal rather than questioning why corporations are allowed to play regions against each other to extract concessions and subsidies? The missing question is simple but dangerous to the status quo. Who actually governs the economy? Is it elected officials making promises on campaign stages or corporate boards responding to financial markets? When you ask that question honestly, moments like this stop being shocking and start being explanatory. And notice how quickly responsibility is shifted. Workers are told to be patient. They are told that short-term pain will lead to long-term gain. They are told that loyalty will be rewarded someday. But corporations are never asked to wait. They are never asked to endure losses for the common good. The asymmetry is built into the system itself. This is not a story about bad actors behaving badly. It is a story about a system that systematically produces these outcomes regardless of who is in office. Until that system is confronted directly, we will keep seeing the same cycle repeat with different names, different countries, and the same communities left behind, wondering why the future keeps slipping out of reach. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to step back and look at the broader political economy that shaped these decisions long before the latest headlines appeared. For decades, we were told that global integration would lift all boats, that if companies were free to move capital and production wherever it was most efficient, prosperity would eventually trickle down to everyone. What was rarely acknowledged is that this model weakens labor's bargaining power, while strengthening the leverage of large firms that can credibly threaten to leave. When Boeing evaluates where to build, it is not weighing loyalty against betrayal. That is comparing regulatory stability, labor costs, public subsidies, and access to markets. Canada's appeal lies not only in tariffs or geography, but in predictability. A company can plan years ahead without worrying that sudden policy shifts will upend its cost structure. In contrast, an environment defined by trade wars and abrupt changes creates risk, and capital is deeply allergic to risk. This is why tariffs on their own so often backfire. They raise costs without rebuilding domestic capacity. They punish supply chains without offering a coherent industrial strategy in return. The result is not a renaissance of manufacturing, but a search for alternative routes around the barriers. Production does not return home, it simply relocates. Now consider how this is sold politically. Voters are told that foreign countries are stealing jobs, that the problem lies outside the border. This framing is powerful because it channels real economic pain into a clear target. But it also conveniently obscures the role of corporate governance, financial markets, and domestic policy choices that made offshoring and fragmentation the default strategy in the first place. Look at who has influence in shaping these outcomes. Large corporations spend enormous resources lobbying for favorable rules, subsidies, and flexibility. They argue that competitiveness requires freedom of movement. Governments fearful of losing investment comply. This creates a race where regions compete to offer the most attractive conditions, often at the expense of labor protections and public revenue. Workers are told this competition is unavoidable. In reality, it is designed for ordinary people. The consequences show up in subtle but relentless ways. Wages stagnate even as productivity rises. Job security erodes. Benefits become conditional and temporary. Communities are forced to reinvent themselves again and again, each time with fewer resources. The promise that hard work will lead to stability feels increasingly hollow, not because workers failed, but because the system no longer rewards commitment. And yet, when moments like this occur, the conversation rarely turns to reforming corporate power or rebuilding public capacity. Instead, it becomes a spectacle of outrage. One leader shouts, another country celebrates, media cycles move on, the underlying dynamics remain untouched. This is the deeper lesson of the Boeing shift. It reveals how limited national politics are when economic power is transnational. It shows that without rules that bind capital to social obligations, appeals to patriotism are little more than branding exercises. Companies respond to incentives, not slogans. So, when you hear that jobs are collapsing and leaders are furious, ask yourself what would actually have to change for a different outcome to be possible, what rules would need to be rewritten, whose power would need to be curtailed, and who, for decades, has benefited from the system exactly as it is, because until those questions are faced openly, we will keep reliving this story, watching production move, communities fracture, and political anger rise, all while being told that the next policy tweak will finally make things right. At this point, it becomes impossible to ignore how selectively responsibility is assigned. When corporations move, it is framed as market logic. When workers demand security, it is framed as entitlement. This double standard is so normalized that many people no longer question it, yet it shapes every outcome you are seeing now. Boeing is treated as a neutral actor responding to forces beyond its control, while workers are told to adapt, retrain, relocate, or accept less. This logic has consequences far beyond aerospace. It defines housing markets, healthcare access, and education. When jobs leave a region, property values fall, tax bases shrink, and public services deteriorate. Schools lose funding, hospitals struggle, local governments are forced into austerity. None of this shows up in quarterly earnings reports, but it defines daily life for millions of families. The economic shock does not stay contained within the factory gates. It ripples outward. What makes this moment particularly revealing is how quickly the narrative turns toward retaliation instead of reflection. Calls for counter tariffs, punishment, and escalation dominate the conversation. Very little attention is given to rebuilding domestic manufacturing capacity in a durable way. That would require long-term public investment, labor protections, and a willingness to challenge corporate governance norms that prioritize shareholders above all else. Those conversations threaten entrenched interests, so they are avoided. Notice also how workers are pitted against each other across borders. American workers are encouraged to resent Canadian workers. Canadian success is framed as American loss. This division serves a purpose. It prevents solidarity. It ensures that anger flows horizontally instead of upward. Meanwhile, the corporations that orchestrate these moves maintain flexibility and leverage largely insulated from the social fallout. This is where the idea of industrial policy becomes unavoidable. Countries that succeed in maintaining high-value manufacturing do not rely on slogans. They coordinate education, infrastructure, finance, and labor standards over decades. They make clear that public support comes with public obligations. Without that framework, tariffs are blunt instruments that create disruption without direction. In the United States, industrial policy has often been reduced to defense spending and crisis bailouts. Outside of emergencies, markets are left to decide, but markets do not plan for communities. They do not invest in people unless returns are guaranteed. Expecting them to do so is not realism, it is wishful thinking. The Boeing case also exposes how fragile political legitimacy becomes when economic promises repeatedly fail. Voters are told that pain is temporary, that sacrifice will be rewarded. When the opposite occurs, trust erodes, cynicism grows. People disengage or turn toward increasingly extreme narratives in search of explanations. This is not a cultural failure, it is a rational response to structural disappointment. And yet, even now, the opportunity for learning is there. This moment could prompt a serious reckoning with how trade, labor, and corporate power interact. It could open space for policies that bind investment to employment, that reward firms for staying rather than leaving, that treat workers as assets rather than costs. Whether that happens depends on where attention is directed. If the conversation remains fixated on personalities and national pride, nothing will change. If it shifts towards systems and incentives, something might. That is the choice embedded in this story. And it is why moments like this matter far more than the outrage cycle suggests. What often goes unspoken is how deeply these outcomes are shaped by financialization. Over time, companies like Boeing have been transformed from producers of complex goods into vehicles for maximizing financial returns. Decisions about where to build, who to employ, and how long to invest are filtered through the expectations of markets that demand constant growth. In that environment, stability for workers becomes a liability, not a virtue. This helps explain why public institutions appear so weak in moments like this. Governments have gradually surrendered tools that once allowed them to guide investment. Capital controls were dismantled, labor protections were weakened, anti-rust enforcement faded. The result is a political system that reacts to corporate decisions rather than shaping them. Leaders can scold and threaten, but without structural leverage, their power is performative. For ordinary people, this feels like standing on shifting ground. You follow the rules, you train, you commit, and then the rules change. The factory closes, the contract moves, the future you planned dissolves. When this happens repeatedly, people stop believing in long-term promises. They focus on survival. That erosion of trust is one of the most damaging consequences of this system, and it rarely makes the headlines. Meanwhile, corporations are adept at presenting their choices as unavoidable. They speak the language of competitiveness and global reality, but competitiveness is not a law of nature. It is shaped by policy. It reflects choices about taxes, labor rights, trade agreements, and public investment. When those choices favor mobility of capital over stability of communities, the outcome is predictable. This is why simply reversing a tariff or offering a subsidy is unlikely to solve the problem. Without binding commitments, incentives become temporary bargains. Companies take the benefits, then move again when conditions change. Workers are left chasing an ever-moving target. Real change would require redefining the social contract between corporations and society. And that brings us to the deeper political risk. When people see that neither party can or will confront corporate power directly, faith in democratic accountability weakens. Anger becomes untethered. It looks for simple villains and dramatic solutions. This is fertile ground for demagoguery, but it is created by economic failure, not rhetoric alone. The Boeing shift should therefore be understood as a warning not just about trade policy, but about the limits of a system that treats labor as disposable and communities as interchangeable. Canada may benefit today, but the underlying logic remains global and mobile. Without coordination and shared standards, the same pressures will reappear elsewhere. As viewers, as citizens, the most important step is to resist the shallow framing. Do not ask only who won and who lost this round. Ask why workers everywhere are placed in competition instead of cooperation. Ask why corporations retain freedom without obligation. Ask why economic security is treated as an unrealistic demand rather than a basic foundation. These questions are uncomfortable because they challenge deeply embedded assumptions. But they are necessary if we want a future that does not replay this story endlessly with different names and locations. The choice is not between nationalism and globalization. It is between an economy organized around private extraction and one organized around shared prosperity.